So good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Walker, and I'm with the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this webinar, Keeping Rivers Flowing, Innovative Strategies to Protect and Restore Rivers. This is the second presentation of a three-part series where we will explore what actions being taken to protect and restore rivers around the world, in the U.S. and here in Texas. Today we'll be focusing on programs in the western U.S., and we hope to bring the best of what is happening back to Texas and explore whether these applications make sense for our state. We have three very knowledgeable presenters today. First, we'll be hearing from Russell Schnitzer with the Trout Unlimited. He's the Agricultural Policy Advisor for their Western Water Project. He will discuss their program to engage and work with the agricultural sector to get waters in streams and state-level efforts to get laws in place that help rivers. Russ will be followed by longtime Texas Living Waters Project collaborator Mary Kelly. Mary has many years' experience working on water supply solutions in the western U.S. and in Texas. She'll be discussing market-based solutions for keeping water in rivers. Myron Hess with the National Wildlife Federation will bring us back to Texas and discuss opportunities and approaches that we might consider in our home state. Now, a few logistics. The webinar will be 60 minutes in length with 10 minutes included at the end for questions and answers. You can listen to the audio through your computer speakers or via telephone. You can select either option through the control panel on the right side of your screen. All webinar participants are muted. However, we do want to hear from you. Please type in your questions in the control panel on the right side of your screen as we proceed. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll select several questions to hand off to Russell, Mary, and Myron for the Q&A period, and we'll attempt to answer others as we proceed. Thank you for attending the Keeping Rivers Flowing webinar today. Let's go ahead and get started. I'll switch it over to our first presenter, Russ, and we'll get him going. All right, Russ, you should be ready to go.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everybody, for joining in for this conversation today. My name is Russ Schnitzer. As Jennifer said, I work for Trout Unlimited, Agricultural Policy Advisor for Trout Unlimited's Western Water Project. And I'll talk a little bit for some context, give you a little bit of background as to what Trout Unlimited's Western Water Project is. The Water Project started back in 1998 with, I think at the time it started out with just 3 staff in Montana, Idaho, and it was just Montana, Idaho actually to begin with. We've expanded now to be 6 western states as well as California as kind of a companion to the program, although they run a little bit more of an autonomous operation. We've got somewhere close to 55 staff now, all told, in all of these states. Much of that staff is on-the-ground project managers, people that work hand-in-hand with, for the most part, with agricultural producers to implement the types of projects about which we'll talk today, and there'll be some more examples of that in here in the presentation. For those of you that aren't familiar with Trout Unlimited, I should probably take a little bit of a step back there too. Trout Unlimited is a national cold water conservation organization, meaning that we work on headwater streams, trout habitat, as well as salmon habitat throughout North America. We've got programs in pretty much every state where there is trout, at least where there's wild trout. And of course, one of our strongholds is here in the Intermountain West. I'm based in Denver, Colorado.
Russ?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you try speaking up a little bit? Some people are messaging in that they're having a little difficulty hearing.
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
So one of the first things that we look for as we look around in the watersheds that we've identified as priorities, whether they're for wild trout or native trout, we look for the right situations to gain a foothold with the local community, with local producers. And in a lot of instances, that involves addressing old infrastructure issues. In this example, the Franks Fork project, which is located in northwestern Wyoming, you can see here the picture on the top right, an old road crossing, some old culverts with a step down there. It created a barrier to fish passage. In this case, the passage of native Yellowstone cutthroat trout. By putting in this new bridge, removing those culverts, regrading the stream, recreating that habitat, it reconnected more than 15 miles of that trout's habitat in that system, greatly expanding its spawning capabilities and certainly bolstering the strength of that population in the watershed. This was all done in partnership with a large ranch on which that road crossing was located. This next slide is a picture of Badger Creek, a little tributary in south central Idaho. You can see that little inset picture on the lower right. That's what Badger Creek used to look like. That's not even that far in the summer, probably mid-July. Badger Creek would run dry. This is a place that has some endangered species issues with ESA-listed bull trout. It's a small drainage where every little bit of spawning habitat makes a huge difference, and of course where we want to help work with producers to relieve regulatory burden where possible. Here, this is Trout Unlimited did work closely both with agency partners, making sure that Fish and Wildlife Service was in the loop on this, and with the landowners to implement projects like this that helped put more water back in Badger Creek through a lease arrangement with that producer. This next slide, this is Timber Creek, just another example of fish passage. Another example from Wyoming. But you can see how just these minor little infrastructure projects can really impact fish population, and changes can make a huge difference. And the reason that, and this is a picture of a larger piece of infrastructure, a bigger dam that is a diversion dam that is being changed. It's being removed, and we're putting in a completely different structure there. The diverters are still able to access the water to which they're decreed, but at the same time we remove a huge barrier to fish movement. We create additional opportunities for more water being left in the stream during low flow periods. It's just a good win-win, and this is the basis for which we identify a lot of these projects. Sometimes it is just as simple as fish passage. This is a fish screen that we put in partnership with a large ranch operation near Lander, Wyoming, that just prevents fish entrainment in the ditch system. Doesn't change the flow or the timing of their diversion at all. It just keeps fish in the river where they belong. And these projects now, that I talk about a lot of fish passage, a lot of reconnection. These all are stepping stones for bigger conversations about water being made available in stream in places where it's most needed. And that's really the emphasis for the types of work that Trout Unlimited's water project does. When I take just a quick glance around the West at what all of our project people are doing on the ground, the large majority of our projects are related to some fish passage, some upgraded head gates, definitely helping reduce some O&M while at the same time creating a little bit better efficiency from a diversion, but what that does is creates a working relationship. We don't go for the home run with every single conversation we have with a producer. There's fully recognizing the fact that a lot of ranchers and farmers throughout the West are plenty leery of working with conservation groups the way it is. We understand that. We completely respect that. What we need to do as conservation groups, not just Trout Unlimited, we need to earn trust, and we need to, in a sense, put our money where our mouth is. And for a lot of these folks, that is identifying needs that are the lowest hanging fruit and finding a way to make those projects happen. Trout Unlimited is a great example of a partner that can access private capital that a farmer or rancher might otherwise not have access to. We can bring that capital into a project. We can leverage it with public funding from state and federal sources, and we can attract other investment from in-kind contributions and make a project happen in much shorter time frame, much more efficiently, and get the system online in an optimized way as quickly as possible. And that does pay dividends. Neighbors notice. Other ranchers on the ditch will notice. Other ditch companies notice. And before too long, with these types of investments, word of mouth is pretty much all it takes to start having that strength of your brand resonate within the agricultural community. That's our strategy. It's not necessarily a fast-moving one, but it's one that it's one that we're deeply invested in and one that we know works. We invest in staff that are located in rural communities. They're from rural communities. They a lot of times they're part of multi-generational farm and ranch operations, or at least they've grown up with exposure to that. They know how to. They're not just there as conservation organization employees. They are there as part of the community, and that's really a fundamental piece too of any success that we encounter. You see, our guys, even though they all love to fish, what they love even more is to make it work for both agriculture and the fish. They like playing in the dirt. They like heavy equipment, but at the end of it all, they like solutions, and that's really what we're all steering toward here. Let's skip ahead here. This slide is an example of one particularly sticky issue. This was, in fact, it was a dam that we had removed. We negotiated for the removal of the dam. We provided the water in an alternate diversion for those that needed it for irrigation. And in this case, just on the edge of Grand Teton National Park, we opened up more than 20 miles of native Snake River cutthroat trout habitat that hadn't been accessible to these fish for more than 50 years. And that's a great success that is not just ours, not just for the conservation organization. It's also a great success for all of the irrigators that saw the potential that existed in upgrading the system, removing a decrepit old dam, and benefiting from it as well. So here's when we start to move down the line a little bit in our relationship building with agriculture, we can start talking about bigger projects where it makes sense. And you know, in places where we do have these opportunities, in particular, I think of Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, places where the state law permits the in-stream flows can occur in those states. State law provides for it. We're able to implement greater irrigation efficiency practices. and at the same time, we can then take any water that's not needed through that efficiency, and that water can be left in stream during low flow periods. It can be dedicated in stream year round, and these are the types of projects that we hope over time will substantiate those types of statutory changes in states where we currently are unable to do that. States like Wyoming, for example. But it's incremental, and we've got to lead with examples. And the more we're able to bite off in partnership with these ag producers, the more we can talk about a complete package of restoration, of rehabilitating watersheds, and at the same time helping enhance and strengthen agricultural operations up and down the valley. Now this is, I'll flip right back to that top right picture here. Now take a look at this is now water flowing through that recreated stream channel, water that was made available through increased irrigation efficiency. You see that center pivot in the background there. They're no longer flood irrigating in this place where it didn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense to try and continue to do that. They were able to achieve the same kind of production with center pivots, even some enhanced production. And we can take that extra water, put it back in this completely restored stream channel, and at the end of it, I mean, we're talking over the course of 5 years here, we've got new trout habitat that did not exist for, who knows, probably 70 or 80 years in this instance. So it's definitely a success, and I can tell you firsthand, ranchers that do go this far and are committed to seeing things through, they're very proud of the habitat that they create, of the resource that they're then able to steward. It does enhance the value of their operation, and that's something we're proud to be a part of. And in instances like this is a great story from the state of Montana, North Fork of the Blackfoot River, just a world-famous native trout fishery, wild native trout fishery. And back in 2001, we recognized that the North Fork was in pretty dire straits. You see that picture in the upper center? That was September of 2001, and there is not a lot of water flowing down that channel. In fact, it's pretty stressed, pretty dried up, and the water temperature was probably pretty high. There's not a lot that's going to survive in there into the winter months, if that's how it looks in September. We talked with the ranch owners in this case. This is John and Irene Weaver over on the left, a couple that was gracious enough to work with Trout Unlimited, and we identified what their needs were, and mainly that was stock water. And we worked with federal agencies, state funding. We put off-channel solar-powered stock water tanks in up and down their operation where they identified the need was greatest. They no longer needed to divert the water that they were using for their old stock water tanks. So 3 years later, in the same month, September of 2004, after we were able to purchase the lease of that surplus water from them and leave it in the North Fork of the Blackfoot, that's how it looked. From the same perspective, that's a pretty strong contrast. Even if it was a particularly good water year, that's a dramatic difference, and that's a benefit for the entire riparian system, not just trout. So when we talk about connecting these various infrastructure projects with in-stream flow needs, like I said, it's beginning with irrigation efficiency improvements. Maybe it's switching from flood to sprinkler where it makes sense, or maybe it's just being more efficient with the flood irrigation, and maybe it's piping a ditch. There's a lot of tools at our disposal working hand in hand with a producer to identify what's right. What does result then, some people call it conserved water. Here in Colorado, the state has determined that we're going to call it efficiency savings. That's really the issue at hand when we're talking about the implementation of those more efficient practices. And with that water, we've got some options. There are informal agreements, informal arrangements with producers where it's kind of an under-the-table arrangement where water is made available during low-flow periods. That's in places where state statute doesn't provide for it, like Colorado and Wyoming, for example. We also will lease for in-stream flows where that makes sense or where it's possible. We'll bring some private money to the table to secure a commitment of in-stream flow for a set term. And then we can also, in places where the state statute permits, Montana and Idaho are great examples, where we can just get dedicated in-stream flow that is part of the water rights. It remains whole. The water right remains whole. It prevents anybody from the threat of abandonment of their water right, and it further it helps. It secures that water in the stream without the threat of injury to other users downstream. Irrigation efficiency savings, to go a little bit more in depth about that, we've been spending a lot of time talking about that in Colorado over the last year or so, and trying to figure out a way in a state where prior appropriation doctrine reigns, can we tweak the state statute to allow a producer to leave their efficiency savings in stream? That statutory change proposal that we introduced here during the last legislative session, it did make it through the state Senate and the state House, but not without falling prey to politics. And it doesn't look good for the governor to sign that bill, but it does show that there is at least some interest in moving some things forward here in Colorado and helping bring additional tools to be made available to ag producers, to irrigators throughout western Colorado in particular, so that they can access some additional capital necessary to make irrigation efficiency improvements that are so needed. Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, I've talked about that a couple of times. Those are states with statutory provisions that allow for in-stream flow. And really the thing that we're talking most about here is in states like Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, places where we know that we can make more tools available and that in-stream flow and agriculture can coexist. We've got to come to that through some kind of a mutually agreeable process, hand in hand, led by agriculture if at all possible. The example here in Colorado, very collaborative. It was convened by the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. It involved members of the Colorado Farm Bureau, other independent ranchers and irrigators. We need to make sure that anytime we're talking about in-stream flow provisions in these western states and with agricultural water, these need to be agricultural proposals. They can't come from a conservation organization. They can't be perceived as being Enviro or Greenie. There's just no traction there. Agricultural collaboration is the key here. And through that process, over the course of 8 months of regular dialogue last year, we identified common ground. We established a set of principles that would guide any discussion around water use and management, any statutory changes that we would propose for the state. We identified those mutual objectives, and we're realistic about what we might achieve and what factors were in favor and what factors were opposed. We worked together, and we will continue to work together, whether or not the state statute stands here in Colorado or whether or not we're able to get stronger bills in Utah. or whether we're able to even get off the ground in Wyoming, we still need to be on the phone regularly with these ag leaders throughout these states, just to continue the on-the-ground implementation that is so important. Over time, we're going to get there. We're going to find where the path of least resistance does exist, but it's not something that happens fast, and it's not something that necessarily happens easy. We've got to remain committed to the end goal. So it's just some example of some project partners Trout Unlimited works with on a regular basis. That's pretty much the end of it for my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. Just to qualify, I'm not a water attorney by any means. I'm just a policy guy, a policy hack, but I have a lot of examples here, and I'm happy to share them with whoever's interested. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Russ. That was very interesting. I really appreciate the pictures of beautiful rivers and mountains as well. I don't get to see enough of that. Let me switch the presentation over and get Mary Kelly started. Hold on one second. All right, there we go.
Thanks, Jennifer, playing musical chairs here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of market transactions in securing water for the environment. And I think, as you've heard from Russ, through the Western Water Project of Trout Unlimited and through some of the other efforts I'm going to speak about today, market transactions are playing a bigger role throughout the West, primarily where we're looking at restoring stream flow, but also in some cases in protecting existing stream flow. So market transactions, and by this I mean voluntary transactions between sellers or lessors and buyers or lessees. It's just one tool in the toolbox. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. I think it's a tool that Trout Unlimited and others have demonstrated can have great success because it's collaborative. But I think it's important to remember that there are other ways that water is secured for the environment, maybe not as collaborative sometimes, but it is also the law. And we can put permit conditions on new permits. We can do set-asides where there's unappropriated water. Public trust doctrine is used in some states, and then, of course, the Endangered Species Act. And one of the reasons I want to highlight ESA is because, frankly, the ESA has brought a lot of money to the table for voluntary transactions and existing rights, money that has actually provided benefit to a lot of irrigators and irrigation districts. So it's not all downside with ESA. One of the other reasons I want to highlight it is that there are a lot of opportunities to use market transactions to avoid the listing of new species under the ESA and kind of get out ahead of that more detailed regulatory framework. So just a little bit of terminology as we go forward. By market transactions, surface water rights in virtually all the western states are in fact marketable property rights. They can be transferred within the provisions of state law, the State Water Code. Also, often there are provisions in the bylaws or charters if you're in an irrigation district about whether a right can be transferred or not. In some cases, individual farmers can engage in a transaction even if they're within an irrigation district. But the more common approach is that the irrigation district has to approve the transaction itself. There are both purchases and leases. The leases can be long-term or short-term, or they can provide that they're only exercised in a dry year, in a drought year. Otherwise, the water goes for irrigation, but if it's a dry year, it stays in stream. They're more informal agreements, so usually they are contracts that are term compensated forbearance, and that's really just paying an irrigator not to use its water. That tends to work better where you don't have any downstream diverters between the place the water is originally diverted and where you want to protect it through in the stream. Of course, water rights being property can also be donated to a state water trust or to a nonprofit. Water rights are far too valuable in the West to often be donated, and I think we'll see that when we talk a little bit, when Myron talks more about the Texas Water Trust. That's not really, it's happened on occasion, but it isn't going to save our streams. So I'm just going to pause here because there's a lot of note passing going on. Am I okay?
Oh, yeah, no, you're
great. All right.
Thank you.
That's right. So what's in it for the environment? Basically, in fully appropriated streams, like the Brazos River here, probably the only way you're going to get water for the environment is through some kinds of transactions. We may be able to do dedication of return flows. There may be reservoir reoperation that can provide flows for the environment, but if you really want to secure legal protection for it, you're going to have to convert some of those existing rights to in-stream flows. Being able to use leases, whether they're dry year option or whether you have compensated forbearance agreements, also gives us more flexibility to our systems. And I think Myron will touch on this later, but in Texas, we really have one of the best frameworks in the West because a private person can hold a right for in-stream flow, an existing right. You can convert an ag right to in-stream flow, or you can add in-stream flow to that ag right, and you don't have to turn it over to the state for in-stream flow, which is quite different from many Western states, and really an important framework to allow producers to feel comfortable with market transactions for in-stream flows. So, you know, Texas, we're about 60%. I think we're maybe even a little bit less on surface water rights for agriculture in Texas, but in many of the Western states, 60 to 80% of the existing surface water rights are held for agricultural irrigation. And obviously in prior appropriation system, older rights are more valuable than junior rights. Buyers can be the government. They can be private or public entities with endangered species obligations, and I'll touch on one of those examples. Or they can be nonprofits, and in particular either an organization like Trout Unlimited or newer organizations that are springing up across the West, including here in Texas, that are formed as water trusts. So I'm just going to briefly go through a few examples here. I might refer you to this paper by Reed Benson that just came out in the Environmental Law Review, which is published by the Lewis and Clark School of Law. He's got a really great overview, one of the more recent ones, of a variety of environmental flow transaction programs throughout the West. It does not include Texas, but he's got some good examples. And for any lawyers on the phone, lots of discussion of the legal framework and the different types of funding sources. So let's start with the Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program up in the Pacific Northwest. This program was started in 2002. It's actually funded through federal hydropower revenues from the Bonneville Power Administration. Those revenues for in-stream flow transactions are administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The program is designed to protect in-stream flows and restore flows for salmon, steelhead, and several other fish in the Pacific Northwest streams. The Columbia Basin program is spending somewhere between $2 and $2.5 million per year on leases and acquisitions in their transactions program. Even with this much money on the table and a really well-developed structure, it takes a while to get started. So their latest report is they've done about somewhere on the order of 60 to 80 transactions, depending on which data report you look at. But I think by 2013, they've done 63 transactions, and they've restored almost 1,000 miles of stream. So they've had some time at it. It takes a while to get started up, but I think it goes back to what Russ was really talking about, is even when you have that much money on the table, it takes time to build up relationships with irrigators and irrigation districts to show how these transactions can have mutual benefit. The Columbia Basin program is interesting because it actually works through different entities. It works through the Freshwater Trust in Oregon, through the Deschutes River Conservancy, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, partners with Trout Unlimited in many cases. It works with the Idaho and Montana state agencies. So the water transactions program itself uses sub-entities that are more local to make the transactions and build up the trust. And I think when we get to Myron's presentation, there might be a kernel of something that could be in the future of the Texas Water Trust in terms of working with different groups in different parts of the state rather than doing it necessarily at the state level. So up on the Deschutes River in Oregon, there's the Deschutes River Conservancy. That was started actually way back in 1996. And it began with a very diverse board of ranchers, farmers, tribes, and conservation organizations. They took several years really to organize themselves, but the idea was what's a mutually beneficial way to begin putting flows back into the stream, particularly in the summer and the fall months. Some of these streams, not all of them, but some of them affected by ESA obligations. The Deschutes Trust receives both money through the BPA and has other sources of federal and private funding. They've been doing about $3 to $4 million a year in transactions, primarily for leases. They've done some interesting experiments, if you want to take a look at their website, with reverse auctions. Reverse auctions are an interesting way to do transactions because essentially you have a pot of money and you put it out there that, come bring us your water right terms, what you would accept for a lease or an acquisition, and we'll go at it that way rather than one-on-one working with any particular irrigator. Some interesting benefits from those reverse auctions, also some difficulty, I think, in managing them. The Deschutes is now moving, they have quite a bit about this on their website, to a much more watershed-based look at benefits of transactions. How can you benefit municipalities, ranchers, and the streams in a couple of their sub-basins here. So I want to just touch on one more example. This is actually not even in the United States, but I think it's a really interesting model, and that's the Colorado River Delta Water Trust. I particularly wanted to mention this because if you were on the first webinar, you might have thought nothing was happening in the Colorado River Delta, but in fact, quite a bit is happening under a binational agreement that was signed in November of 2012. That agreement provided both for a pulse flow that occurred this spring of about 100,000 acre-feet to revive parts of the river and the restoration sites. But the Colorado River Delta Water Trust is an NGO in Mexico, and we are currently raising about $5 million to buy water rights in the Mexicali district to provide base flow to support these restoration sites that you see on this map. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving forward. That's just one of the restoration sites that will be supported by the base flow in the Delta. Just want to mention, here at home, out in the Trans-Pecos area, we actually have the Trans-Pecos Water and Land Trust, of which I currently serve as the interim executive director. And really, we formed this trust with a board of ranchers and NGOs and local community residents to try and test out the mechanism in Texas law that you can add in-stream use to an existing right that was clarified by Senate Bill 3. We leased 3 rights a couple of years ago, each of them for 3 years, totaling about 5,000 acre-feet, and went through the whole administrative process at TCQ and added in-stream flow to it. Farmers out there really liked it. Of course, not a lot of them have any water given the condition of the Rio Grande now. So we're just leasing 1 right now for in-stream flow for about 180 acre-feet. But I think what we've done with the Trans-Pecos Water Trust really could provide a model for some of the other trusts. And I know there's a San Saba one now, one on the Guadalupe River. So it's out there, and I guess it's just here to say that Senate Bill 3 process actually works on adding in-stream use to existing rights, at least if you're not in a complicated downstream situation. So just to highlight a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Myron, the Texas Water Trust. Myron's going to talk about this more. It's actually one of the older trusts, state-run trusts in the West. It was established with Senate Bill 1 in '97. It doesn't have very many rights in it. Big reason, it doesn't have any money. So that's, to me, the central problem we have to solve is how are we going to get money into the Texas Water Trust, and what kind of structure is it going to have going forward? The trust is actually the subject of the House Natural Resource Committee interim charges, and there's going to be a lot going on in that discussion, I hope. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Myron.
Okay, and let me just pull Myron's slides up because they are in the right order here. All right. Myron is going to do his presentation now. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us today. Hope you're enjoying the discussion. This is, this is one of those important options that we are looking at moving forward. How are we going to protect our rivers, and in Texas, our bays and estuaries? And as Mary alluded to, there's some regulatory approaches, but really what we're talking about today is focusing on sort of marketing type approaches. What things can we do in a situation like we have in Texas, where we've issued a tremendous amount of water rights and we haven't really taken care of the environment, and those are perpetual water rights. So what can we do under that situation to protect our flows in our rivers and into our estuaries? We do have a Texas Water Trust established in 1997. The reality, though, is that very few people know about that water trust. It's not really known. It hasn't really been publicized. You would be hard-pressed if you do anything other than a Google search to even find the website information about the Texas Water Trust. If you go to the Water Development Board website, and that's where the Water Trust is housed, you have to go look under water planning, then you have to look under the water bank, and then you get to the water trust. So not the most obvious thing in the world that people are going to be very aware of. Mary alluded to the fact that, yes, it's been in existence for a long time. It doesn't have very many water rights. As you'll see from this slide, there are basically 3 water rights in the water trust. 2 of those in the Rio Grande, 1 on the San Marcos River, which is in the Guadalupe River Basin. The good news, I guess, for those are both perpetual term deposits, because in the water trust, water can be put in there on a term basis, a temporary basis, or on a perpetual basis. And in this case, both of those are perpetual. So that's the good news. The bad news is, as we say, there are only 3 water rights, and the latest transaction was in 2006, so 8 years ago, more than 8 years ago. You'll also see at the bottom here is the links for those, the more regional water trusts that Mary was alluding to, Guadalupe, Blanco, Trans-Pecos, and San Saba. And those are models that, particularly in a lot of areas of the West, that are being looked at as a more regional basis, where maybe people are not as comfortable dealing with the state government on the water right, but maybe they would be more comfortable dealing on a local trust that's run by local folks. So one of the advantages we do have in Texas is that we have clear authority to convert water rights to existing water rights to environmental flow protection purposes. And that can be done either by taking a right that's, say, for an irrigation use and completely changing it so that its use in the future is just environmental flow protection, or it can be retaining that irrigation use and adding environmental flow protection as an additional use. So we do have that advantage of having very clear state law. That was clarified in 2007, that can be done. And as Mary mentioned, that can be done by putting a right in the water trust, or it can be done by the person who owns the water right. And they can make that change to the water right and retain it. They don't have to put it in a trust. So we have that flexibility. In each case, there is an administrative process that has to be followed in order to add that use, whether you're putting it into the water trust or whether you're doing that individually. And so that's something that we have to work through. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what's needed to make this, to move transactions forward. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but just some things to I guess, get people thinking about it. I think first and foremost, we need a better and broader appreciation of the problem. We need people to understand that this really is an issue. In a lot of places in the West where streams are absolutely drying up, it's pretty obvious. We're trying to be get a little bit ahead of this issue, particularly in some of our estuaries where, you know, the estuary doesn't go dry, but it can be having dramatic impacts. And the idea is, how can we get ahead of this situation so that we start protecting flows before we get to the point of sort of irreparably harming our estuaries or our streams. But water rights are a bit arcane, and so people don't always understand that this is a real issue. So getting that better appreciation that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, that's important on a couple of levels. With respect to the water trust, you know, we don't really have an active advocate on behalf of that water trust, on behalf of getting water rights into the trust. And then second, on helping people who might want to put water into the trust, facilitating the administrative approval process that's required to do that. And then a key issue is, well, what about funding? Yes, we may be able to get some donations, but we need funding, first of all, just to get somebody out advocating for donations. But secondly, to really get this to scale, we have to have funding to do actual acquisitions. And then the other thing that sort of comes with that is having demonstrated precedent of these sort of transfers that work, that people see over time. Yes, somebody's added environmental use, or they put water in the trust, and they've been comfortable with that. Having some precedent to point to is also critically important. So I want to talk briefly, and I know this is a lot of numbers, about one of the ways that we're starting to develop better information about the need for environmental flow protection. And this is coming out of the Senate Bill 3 process. So one of the things that process does is have scientists get together and come up with their recommendations of what does it take to have a healthy, a sound ecological environment, whether it's in an estuary or whether it's in a river. Some agreement on what does it really take, how much is needed from a scientific perspective. So we are getting that information out of the SB3 process. Whatever we think about how effective the standards are, how close the standards come to meeting what the scientists recommend, we do have that scientific information. So I want to talk just a couple of examples out of this to maybe illustrate it. And this is for Matagorda Bay, what came out of the science team for the Colorado and Lavaca basins. And basically, on this particular row, there's, on the left-hand column, there's a regime that's being talked about. In this case, it's the minimum monthly inflow. So there's a minimum amount that scientists say we don't ever want, we don't want the bay to see less than this water in any given month. And so they recommended in the middle column, the scientists said, we want this to be met 100% of the time. If you go over to the right-hand column, what that column says is that using our water availability models, if all the existing water rights that have been issued were fully exercised and there were no return flows, hopefully we won't get to that point, but if we were at that point, we would only meet that threshold about 66% of the time. So far below what the scientists have recommended. If you wanted to try to meet that gap between what would be available in the future and what the scientists recommended, you know, yes, we could potentially we can get a dedication of wastewater return flows, and we need that. But if you're going to do an acquisition, this is one where you need a senior water right that's very reliable because you want to meet it 100% of the time. And that means it's going to be expensive because the most senior water right is the most valuable water right. And that assumes, of course, water would be available for a transaction. I'm going to move down a little bit now to another regime that's a higher flow amount that will be met with lower frequency. And the point I want to make here is that the scientists are saying this amount, which would produce more healthy conditions in the bay, whereas that first threshold, which is just kind of a survival level, we don't need to meet that 100% of the time, and even historically the bay didn't necessarily see that 100% of the time. So the scientists say we want that 60% of the time in the future, but if you go over to the right-hand column, the existing water rights fully exercised, we'd only need it 12% of the time. So that's troubling. That's a big gap. But one of the things to recognize here is that if we could acquire even some water rights that are not real senior or not fully reliable, we can make up that gap. And those rights, arguably, will not be as expensive as some of the more reliable water rights. So that's just sort of an illustration of some of the factors you can look at if you're doing acquisitions of what kind of water right do you want to target. So we do have an opportunity coming up with respect to the interim charge on the House Committee on Natural Resources. They're looking at both the issue of land stewardship and the issue of the Texas Water Trust. So it's a real opportunity to discuss some of the things that we can do to make the water trust more effective, and of course to help incentivize better land stewardship, help us protect water quality and protect water rights. There's a hearing scheduled on June 25th. Will be the first hearing to look at this, and along with a couple of other issues that are being considered by that committee that will start that process off. So that discussion is going to be, will start up. Usually reports that come out of the interim committee or the interim charges come out around the end of the year before the legislative session starts next year. I want to touch briefly on a potential funding opportunity that we have. That sometimes out of bad things, out of bad events, some good things can happen. This is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. As a result of that, Congress passed the Restore Act, which will dedicate 80% of Clean Water Act civil penalties for restoration, ecological or economic restoration of the Gulf. It's a fairly complicated process. Some of that money going to 5 different states. Texas is in line to get some of the money. The amount of civil penalties is still under litigation. The exact amount of that is unknown. This chart sort of shows the spectrum. It could be just millions of dollars. It could be billions of dollars. The likelihood is that it will be billions of dollars. There was one settlement by one of the parties, Transocean, which was a $1.4 billion settlement by just one of the parties and not necessarily one of the biggest players in that. So Texas could stand to get out of the civil penalties anywhere from hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. We do know that Texas will get over $200 million from settlement of some of the criminal penalties related to that oil spill. So there is the potential, and there's going to be a lot of competition for these funds, but there is the potential for this money to help provide some funding to fund some transactions to create that precedent we need to demonstrate that this kind of these transactions can really work in Texas. And again, I'll end with a note just saying, you know, what we pass on to future generations is going to be determined by what we do in terms of, largely by what we do in terms of protecting flows in our rivers and into our estuaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Myron. We have time for some Q&A right now, and we'll wrap it up at 3. Here are some pretty pictures of rivers for you all to look at while we go through the Q&A with Mary and Myron and Russ. All right, and Jennifer Ellis is going to lead the Q&A section for us.
Okay, so this is a question for Russ, and the asker asks, any examples of challenges faced when dealing with multiple landowners or different interests or ag practices?
Well, there's always challenges. I think that, you know, the one thing that we always lead with is our guys don't go in there with any preconceived notions as to what the answer is or what the solution is, and that approach and that attitude really helps alleviate any potential for some nasty conflicts. Now, we do from time to time, you know, when you're talking about an outfit that puts in irrigation infrastructure, there can be some conflicts, certainly when something doesn't work the way it should. And that will always be a challenge. It seems like anytime we put in a particularly big project, say it's a big new head gate for a diversion, it seems like every year that means that we're going to get record runoff the next year, and it's going to test our piece to its limit. And you know, a lot of times that's very frustrating for the irrigators. But they also know that nobody's perfect, and thankfully we also will have the resources to go in there and fix things very quickly. That's part of our plan. So that's one of it. One piece of it. You know, otherwise, you know, I can think of, you know, some other examples just with agricultural leaders, state leaders, for example, you know, where we've sat at the table and we've hashed out some you know, pretty promising policy language, only to have an organization or even some executives for that organization get cold feet and then turn against us when we try and move ahead with those policy changes. You know, the thing that we've all got to remember is that you know, this is we've all got to live to fight another day, and certainly these aren't fights either. The most important thing is that we continue to identify ways to work together and eliminate any potential for grudge holding on either side of it. Everybody has bad days, everybody has bad weeks. We just have to, you know, keep showing up and keep doing our work.
Great. Thanks a lot, Russ. Okay, this next question is for Myron, and it's relating to restore funds and saying that, you know, for restore funds, we've got money for the coast, but where does money for inland come from?
Right. So one of the requirements for the Restore Act is directed at the coast, so the benefits have to be basically realized within the coastal zone or within 25 miles of the coastal zone. So that's not going to benefit inland portions. I think regardless of where we're talking about, the Restore Act can be funds to start some transactions, to create some precedent. We have to create an ongoing funding mechanism for transactions. We're not going to solve this problem with Restore Act or in any short time frame. It's a long-term challenge. So we're going to have to look at various kinds of mechanisms, whether that's some sort of a fee structure related to water use that's on an ongoing basis. That's one possibility. Obviously, there could be donations attempted, but we're going to have to create those sort of ongoing funding mechanisms that there's not a quick fix to, and that's going to be a hard sell. Another aspect maybe is as water rights are sold in the future, maybe there can be some transaction fee associated with that, and again, that's not an easy sell. That could go towards environmental flow protection.
Great, thank you. Mary, this question is for you and asks, are there governmental incentives that could boost the dedication or lease of water rights?
It's a good question. There has been a lot of back and forth about whether donation of a water right to a nonprofit is eligible for a federal income tax deduction. I would sum it up by saying the law is still slightly unclear on that. I know that actually Trout Unlimited is working to get a formal ruling letter from the IRS on this subject. That is one thing that can happen. There might be some state law property tax incentives that could work. I think, you know, one of the underlying incentives is protecting and restoring in-stream flows, keeps your basin from getting in all wrapped around the axle on Fish and Wildlife regulatory requirements. And so those requirements are not going away anytime soon. And so getting out ahead of those and benefiting not only just particular species, but the system as a whole and the economic benefits that come both to people that lease or sell their water rights and that come from a healthy river, the widespread benefits that come from a healthy river in terms of fishing, recreation, local economies, is maybe not one thing you can point to as an incentive, but something that we need to talk about more.
Yeah, and this is Myron. I just wanted to interject that, you know, that the property value aspect of a flowing, healthy river is something that we sometimes underestimate, but it's becoming increasingly important, in this economy. That sort of recreational value and the amenity value is now really big.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and start wrapping it up now. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar, and we invite you to join us for our third and final installment on June 25th. Our final webinar will take us across the globe to Australia to learn about the historic Murray-Darling Basin Agreement in Australia. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan provides a coordinated approach to water use in the basin and limits water use at environmentally sustainable levels. And we're going to cover what research, policies, and agreement had to be put in place to make this work. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox, and we hope you can join us. We are going to post a copy of the slides from today's presentation and a video of the webinar on our website at www.texaslivingwaters.org. We will notify you via email when this information is posted. And then one last thing, when you close out the webinar, an evaluation form will pop up. Please take a few minutes to answer that. It's going to give us valuable feedback to improve future presentations. And also, we invite you to subscribe to our blog, Texas Water Solutions. We post blogs on important water policy happenings in Texas about 2 times per month. You can leave your email address in the survey, and we will get you added to the list. And finally, I want to thank our speakers for participating today. And on behalf of Sierra Club, National Wildlife Federation, and the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment, we really appreciate you all and your interest in this topic, and we hope to see you on the internet in June. Please contact us if you have further questions. You'll be receiving information on how to do that. And thank you.